The last person to see the children was Reverend Dale Patterson, who waved goodbye from the church steps as the yellow bus pulled away from Harmony Baptist Church in rural Logan County, Kentucky. It was a Sunday afternoon in April 1978, warm enough that the dogwoods had started blooming along the county roads. 11 children, ages 6 to 14, were heading home after an Easter pageant rehearsal. The driver, a soft-spoken deacon named Vernon Hollis, had driven that same route every Sunday for 6 years without incident. Nobody expected that within 3 hours, all 12 of them would vanish without a trace. The bus should have taken 40 minutes to complete its route through the back roads between Harmony Baptist and the scattered farms where the children lived. When 7 o'clock came and went, with no sign of Vernon or the kids, parents started calling each other. By 8, Deputy Frank Bergman was driving the route himself, his patrol car headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. He found nothing but empty roads and the usual Sunday evening quiet that settled over that part of Kentucky like a heavy quilt. If you're finding this story as unsettling as we did, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We read every single one. My midnight search parties were combing the hills and hollows of Logan County. Volunteers came from 3 counties over, men with hunting dogs and flashlights, women bringing coffee and sandwiches to the makeshift command post at the church. The Kentucky State Police brought in helicopters at first light. They found no skid marks, no signs of an accident, no evidence the bus had ever veered off the main road. It was as if Vernon Hollis had simply steered 12 passengers into another dimension. The bus itself was a 1972 International Harvester, painted yellow with Harmony Baptist Church stenciled in blue letters on both sides. Vernon kept meticulous maintenance records. The vehicle had passed inspection 3 weeks before the disappearance. There was no mechanical reason for it to have broken down, and even if it had, someone would have seen it. The route took the bus through several small communities, past farms where people were still working in their yards that warm April evening. The families left behind were ordinary people, farmers and factory workers, people who'd lived in Logan County for generations. Robert and Nancy Callahan lost both their daughters that day, 9-year-old Patricia and 7-year-old Jennifer. Robert worked the night shift at the machining plant in Russellville. Nancy taught 3rd grade at the elementary school. They'd moved into their farmhouse the year Patricia was born, a white 2-story place with a wraparound porch that Nancy's grandfather had built in 1923. Dennis Crawford, father of 12-year-old Michael, was a mechanic who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam. His wife Catherine had died of cancer the previous winter, and Michael was all he had left. The boy had been struggling, acting out at school, but lately he'd found comfort in the Sunday school program. Reverend Patterson had taken special interest in Michael, encouraging him to help with the younger children during Easter rehearsals. The youngest victim was 6-year-old Amy Pritchard, a small girl with thick glasses who loved to sing. Her parents, James and Linda, ran a dairy farm 5 miles south of the church. They had 4 other children, but Amy was the baby, and Linda would later say she felt like part of her own heart had been cut out that night. James stopped going to church entirely after the disappearance. He couldn't bear to walk past the empty Sunday schoolroom where Amy's name tag still hung on the attendance board. Investigators focused initially on Vernon Hollis himself. At 53, he'd been a deacon at Harmony Baptist for 20 years. He worked as a county road maintenance supervisor during the week and volunteered as the church bus driver every Sunday. He had no criminal record, no debts, no apparent reason to harm anyone. His wife Dorothy was beside herself with worry. They had 3 grown children, all of whom vouched for their father's character. Nothing in Vernon's background suggested he was capable of kidnapping or worse. Then came the theories. Some believed Vernon had suffered a medical emergency while driving, causing him to crash in some remote location where the bus couldn't be spotted from the air. Others suspected foul play. Perhaps someone had forced Vernon off the road, though this seemed unlikely on such a well-traveled route. The most disturbing theory was that Vernon himself had planned the disappearance, that he'd driven those children somewhere deliberately. The FBI joined the investigation in the second week. Special agents interviewed everyone who'd been at the church that Sunday, trying to piece together any detail that might provide a clue. They discovered that Vernon had stopped to fill the bus with gas that morning at a station in Auburn. The attendant remembered him clearly, said he seemed perfectly normal, even joked about the upcoming baseball season. Vernon had bought a pack of gum and a cup of coffee. Nothing suggested a man about to commit an unthinkable act. Psychics arrived within days, offering their services to the desperate families. One woman from Louisville claimed she'd had visions of the children near water, possibly the Green River. Search teams dragged sections of the river for weeks, finding nothing. Another psychic insisted the bus was hidden in an old tobacco barn somewhere in the county. Volunteers checked every abandoned structure for miles around. The psychics meant well, but they only added to the agony, giving families false hope that collapsed into deeper despair. The investigation uncovered one puzzling detail. On Saturday night, the evening before the disappearance, someone had called Vernon's house around 9 o'clock. Dorothy answered, and the caller asked to speak with Vernon about the bus route for tomorrow. Vernon took the call in the kitchen, and Dorothy went upstairs to bed. She never asked him about it, assuming it was someone from church with a question about pickup times. After Vernon vanished, investigators tried to trace that call, but in 1978, before call records were routinely kept by small-town phone companies, it proved impossible. As weeks turned into months, the media attention faded. The families were left with nothing but questions and the terrible weight of not knowing. Robert Callahan spent his weekends driving the back roads, searching for any sign of the bus, any clue the professionals might have missed. He wore out 3 vehicles over the years, covering thousands of miles through Kentucky and neighboring states. Nancy stopped teaching. She couldn't face other people's children anymore. Dennis Crawford became obsessed with the case. He filled notebooks with theories, drew maps, tracked down rumors and leads that police had dismissed. He believed someone knew something, that someone in Logan County was keeping a terrible secret. He attended every town meeting, every county fair, watching faces, listening to conversations, hoping someone would slip up and reveal what they knew. The community tried to heal, but certain wounds don't close. Harmony Baptist Church saw its attendance drop by half within a year. Many families couldn't bear to return to the place where they'd last seen their children. Reverend Patterson, who blamed himself for letting the children leave that afternoon, developed severe depression. He left the ministry in 1980 and moved to Florida, telling friends he couldn't live with the constant reminder of his failure to protect those kids. In 1983, 5 years after the disappearance, a hunter found rusted bus parts in a ravine near the Tennessee border, about 80 miles from Harmony Baptist Church. The discovery brought investigators rushing back, convinced they'd finally found the crash site. But closer examination revealed the parts were from a much older vehicle, a 1950s-era school bus that had been dumped there decades earlier. It was another crushing disappointment for families who'd allowed themselves to hope. The case went cold. Files were boxed and stored in a basement room at the state police barracks. The families marked anniversaries privately, each April bringing fresh pain. Some moved away, unable to live in a place where every road and building held memories of the children they'd lost. Others stayed, feeling that leaving would be a betrayal, that they needed to be there in case their children somehow found their way home. The bus had been equipped with a 2-way radio, standard equipment for church vehicles in that era. Vernon would check in with Dorothy before starting his route each Sunday, a routine they'd established for safety. The radio had been silent that April evening in 1978, but that wasn't the end of the story. That radio would speak again years later, in the most unsettling way imaginable. In 1995, 17 years after the disappearance, James and Linda Pritchard still lived on their dairy farm. Their other children had grown and moved away, starting families of their own, but James and Linda couldn't leave. Amy's bedroom remained untouched, a shrine to the little girl who loved to sing. Linda went in there every morning, sat on the edge of the bed, and talked to her daughter as if she might somehow hear. On a November night that year, James was in the barn dealing with a calving when he heard something that made his blood freeze. It was past midnight, cold enough that his breath made clouds in the air, and the sound coming from the old equipment shed behind the barn was impossible. It was a voice on a radio, crackling with static but unmistakable. A man's voice saying, "Dorothy, this is Vernon. Can you hear me?" James ran to the shed, his heart hammering. The voice continued, patient, repeating the same message. "Dorothy, this is Vernon. Can you hear me?" The shed had been used for storage since before Amy's disappearance. James kept old farm equipment there, broken machinery he meant to fix someday, boxes of tools and supplies. He yanked the door open, and the voice got louder. It was coming from a radio mounted on a shelf, an old two-way unit covered in dust and cobwebs. The radio belonged to Harmony Baptist Church. James recognized the equipment immediately. He'd helped install the system in 1976, back when the church purchased the bus and decided they needed communication equipment for safety. When the church finally closed in 1984, many items had been sold off or distributed to congregation members. James had taken the spare radio unit thinking he might use it on the farm. He'd put it in the shed and forgotten about it for more than a decade. "Dorothy, this is Vernon. Can you hear me?" The voice kept repeating. James's hands shook as he picked up the microphone. "Vernon, is that you?" Static, the voice continued as if James hadn't spoken, the same message over and over. James ran back to the house and called Dennis Crawford, who still lived in the same house where he'd raised Michael. Dennis arrived within 20 minutes, despite the late hour. Together they listened to the transmission. Dennis recognized Vernon's voice immediately. 17 years hadn't erased it from his memory. He'd heard Vernon call out Sunday school attendance, lead prayers, make announcements about church events. This was Vernon, no question, but how was it possible? The transmission continued for 40 minutes, then stopped abruptly, leaving only the hiss of dead air. Dennis contacted the Kentucky State Police the next morning. The investigator assigned to cold cases, Lieutenant Rebecca Ashworth, came out to the farm with technical equipment. She examined the radio, noting that it had no power source. The unit required electricity to operate, and it hadn't been plugged in. The batteries were original, 17 years old, and completely dead when she tested them. Yet James and Dennis both swore they'd heard Vernon's voice coming through that speaker. Lieutenant Ashworth had the radio taken to a forensics laboratory in Louisville. Technicians confirmed what she'd found at the farm. The unit was inoperable, no power source, no way it could have transmitted or received anything. They checked for some kind of recording device, thinking maybe someone had planted a tape player as a cruel hoax. They found nothing. The radio was exactly what it appeared to be, a defunct piece of 1970s communications equipment. Word spread quickly through what remained of the Harmony Baptist community. Within days, Dorothy Hollis heard about the transmission. She was 70 years old by then, living in a retirement community in Bowling Green. When Lieutenant Ashworth visited her, Dorothy broke down. She hadn't heard her husband's voice in 17 years. She'd buried an empty casket in 1985, unable to bear being a widow to a man who'd never been declared dead. The memorial service had been her way of finding closure that the law couldn't provide. Dorothy confirmed that "Can you hear me?" had been Vernon's standard opening when calling on the church radio. He'd start every transmission that way, waiting for her response before proceeding with whatever he needed to communicate. Hearing about the November transmission brought everything back, all the grief she'd worked so hard to manage. She asked Lieutenant Ashworth one question that the investigator couldn't answer. Was he asking for me, or was he asking for help? The incident sparked renewed interest in the case. Local television stations ran retrospective pieces, and newspapers published updates about the mysterious radio transmission. The story attracted attention from paranormal investigators and skeptics alike. Some believed the transmission was evidence of something beyond normal explanation, a message from the dead or from some other dimension. Others insisted there had to be a rational explanation, even if the forensics couldn't immediately provide one. Robert Callahan, who'd never stopped searching for his daughters, saw the radio transmission as proof that Vernon and the children hadn't simply driven away and started new lives somewhere else. That theory had tormented him for years, the possibility that Patricia and Jennifer were out there somewhere, alive but choosing not to come home. The radio incident convinced him that something catastrophic had happened that April day in 1978, something that prevented Vernon from ever reaching out. Lieutenant Ashworth approached the case with fresh determination. She went through all the original files, looking for details that earlier investigators might have missed. She interviewed people who'd been children themselves in 1978, now adults who might remember something they'd been too young to articulate back then. She created a timeline of Vernon's activities in the weeks before the disappearance, searching for any anomaly. What she found was a pattern so subtle it had been overlooked for 17 years. In the month before April 1978, Vernon had made several trips to a remote area of Logan County, near the Tennessee state line. He told Dorothy he was scouting fishing spots for a church youth outing planned for summer. But Vernon had never been much of a fisherman, and the church had no record of planning such an outing. Dorothy hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Vernon often helped plan church activities, and she trusted him completely. Lieutenant Ashworth drove to the area Vernon had supposedly been scouting. It was rugged country, steep hillsides covered in oak and hickory, with narrow roads that turned to mud when it rained. She talked to the few residents who lived out there, showing them photographs of Vernon and the bus. An elderly man named Gilbert Hobson remembered seeing a yellow church bus in the area that spring, parked near an old logging road that ran up into the Daniel Boone National Forest. Gilbert hadn't thought much of it at the time. Church groups sometimes used the logging roads to access hiking trails, but he remembered being surprised to see the bus there more than once, always midweek, never on Sunday when you'd expect a church outing. He'd mentioned it to his wife, but neither of them had connected it to the disappearance. They didn't attend Harmony Baptist, and the media coverage had focused on the regular Sunday route, not on remote logging roads an hour away. Lieutenant Ashworth organized a search of the area Gilbert described. It was November 1995, and the leaves had fallen from the trees, making it easier to see through the forest. Search and rescue teams went up the logging road on foot, moving slowly, checking every ravine and hollow. 3 miles in, where the road narrowed to little more than a path, they found it. The ravine was steep, hidden by a rock outcropping that had protected it from aerial searches in 1978. At the bottom, more than 100 feet down, lay the remains of a yellow bus. The forest had begun to reclaim it, vines growing through the windows, rust consuming the metal. But the blue letters were still visible on one side. Harmony Baptist Church. Getting to the bus required technical climbing equipment. When investigators finally reached it 2 days later, they found skeletal remains inside, 12 sets of them. The medical examiner would later confirm what everyone already knew. Vernon Hollis and 11 children from Harmony Baptist Church had been at the bottom of that ravine since April 1978. The forensic investigation revealed what had happened. Vernon had driven the bus up the logging road, far beyond where any church group would reasonably go. The road had given way, collapsing under the bus's weight, sending the vehicle tumbling into the ravine. The impact would have been catastrophic. Death came quickly for most of the passengers. A few, based on evidence found in the bus, had survived the initial crash but died within hours from injuries that would have been treatable at a hospital. The question that tormented everyone was why Vernon had driven up there in the first place. Lieutenant Ashworth found the answer in Vernon's financial records, which had been reviewed in 1978 but not thoroughly investigated. Vernon had been embezzling from the church building fund, small amounts over several years, totaling nearly $12,000. In 1978, that was serious money, enough to destroy a man's reputation and send him to prison. The church treasurer had begun noticing discrepancies in March 1978. He'd scheduled a meeting with Reverend Patterson for April 24th, the Monday after Easter Sunday, to discuss his concerns. Vernon knew the investigation was coming. He'd been the one taking collection deposits to the bank, skimming cash and falsifying the records. Once the treasurer started asking questions, the scheme would unravel quickly. Investigators believed Vernon had panicked. His plan, they theorized, was to take the bus and disappear, leaving his family and the church to believe he'd been the victim of foul play. He'd scouted the remote logging road as a place to abandon the bus, making it look like an accident or an abduction. What he hadn't planned for was the road collapsing. What should have been a staged abandonment became a real catastrophe. But why take the children? That question haunted everyone who worked the case. Vernon could have disposed of the bus without passengers. The best explanation investigators could piece together was that Vernon had been caught in his own deception. He'd announced the Sunday route as usual, and the children had boarded normally. Perhaps he'd intended to complete the route and dispose of the bus later, but something made him deviate from the plan. They would never know for certain. Vernon's final thoughts died with him at the bottom of that ravine. The families finally had answers, but those answers brought little comfort. Patricia and Jennifer Callahan were laid to rest in a cemetery near their family farm, 34 years after the day they'd climbed onto that bus. Michael Crawford was buried next to his mother. Amy Pritchard got the funeral her parents had dreamed of, with singing, just as she would have wanted. All 11 children came home. Dorothy Hollis attended every funeral, weeping and apologizing to parents who didn't know whether to comfort her or turn her away. She'd lost her husband, but these people had lost their children, and her husband was the reason. The Pritchards embraced her at Amy's service. "You didn't know," Linda said. "None of us knew what he was capable of." But Dorothy knew she'd never forgive herself for not seeing the signs, for not asking harder questions when Vernon had started making those unexplained trips into the backcountry. The radio transmission remained unexplained. Technical experts had no scientific explanation for how a dead radio with no power source could broadcast Vernon's voice. Some in the community believed it was Vernon's spirit, trying to reach Dorothy one last time, asking forgiveness or offering an explanation he could never give in life. Others thought it was a bizarre electrical phenomenon, some kind of stored energy in the radio components that released under particular atmospheric conditions. Dennis Crawford had his own theory. He believed the transmission wasn't supernatural or scientific, but something simpler and more painful. He thought that in the moments after the crash, while Vernon lay dying in that ravine, he'd tried to call for help on the bus radio. His last words had been for his wife, asking if she could hear him, trying to tell her where they were, to send rescue for the children who were still alive. But the ravine was too deep, the signal too weak. No one had heard him then. Somehow, 17 years later, that desperate message had found its way out of the darkness. Lieutenant Ashworth closed the case in December 1995. The official report stated that Vernon Hollis had caused the deaths of 11 children through criminal negligence while attempting to flee embezzlement charges. The radio incident was noted in the file, but listed as unexplained. Rebecca Ashworth, who'd worked homicides and missing persons for 15 years, said in a later interview that the Harmony Baptist case was the one that stayed with her, the one that made her question whether she understood everything about how the world worked. James Pritchard removed the radio from his equipment shed and gave it to Linda, who wanted to keep it. She said it was the last piece of Amy's story, the thing that finally brought their daughter home. She put it on a shelf in Amy's bedroom, next to the photographs and the Sunday school attendance pin Amy had earned for perfect attendance in the months before she died. Sometimes, late at night, Linda would sit in that room and thank Vernon Hollis for trying to call for help, even if his call came 17 years too late. The logging road where the bus went over was closed permanently. The Forest Service put up a memorial at the entrance, a simple stone marker listing 12 names. People still visit, leaving flowers and small tokens, remembering children who never came home from Sunday school and a man who made a terrible choice that destroyed everything he'd built in his 53 years of life. Robert and Nancy Callahan stayed on their farm until Robert's death in 2008. Nancy moved to live with one of her surviving children after that, but she asked to be buried in Logan County, near Patricia and Jennifer. Dennis Crawford never married, dedicating his life to working with missing persons organizations, helping other families navigate the nightmare he'd endured. He died in 2016, and his obituary mentioned Michael first among his survivors, the son he'd lost but never stopped loving. Harmony Baptist Church never reopened. The building stood empty for years before being demolished in 2003. A local businessman bought the land and built a small park there with a playground and picnic tables. On the site where the church once stood, there's a bronze plaque with 11 names and one line, "Taken too soon, but never forgotten." Children play there now, their laughter filling the space where other children once sang hymns and learned Bible verses, unaware of the tragedy that happened on an April Sunday decades before they were born. The case of the Harmony Baptist Church bus became part of Kentucky folklore, the kind of story people tell to illustrate how quickly life can shatter, how a single choice can echo through generations. But for the families who lived through it, it was never folklore. It was 52 years of empty chairs at Thanksgiving, of birthdays marked in cemeteries, of grandchildren who would never exist. It was the knowledge that 12 people left for church one Sunday morning and never came home, and that nothing, not even finding their remains decades later, could ever make that right.